Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Last Week in AI, where you're going to hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will summarize and discuss some of last week's most interesting AI news. And as usual, you can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for a whole bunch more articles we are not going to cover in this episode. I'm one of your hosts, Andrei Kurenkov. I finished my PhD focused on AI at Stanford last year, and I now work at a generative AI startup.
And hi, citizens of the internet. I am Jeremy Harris. I'm one of the co-founders of Gladstone AI. It's an AI national security company, and just spent the last week in DC on the Hill and elsewhere. And so Andre was kind enough to bump our usual recording slot. It's a Saturday. It's I guess it's 6 p.m. for you, Andre?
Yeah, it's a little late, but you're going to get all the news this week that crammed in. Usually there's a few day gap between recording and editing. This time is going to be very short. So we're going to try and get all the news from this past week. So that's good for listeners.
Very fresh.
And before we dive into news, as usual, I want to spend just a bit of time calling out some feedback. We had one review on Apple Podcasts show up from Radar3699. And the title of the review is Less AI Doom Please. And the text of the review is Less AI Doom Please. So pretty clear cut.
What do you think they're trying to say?
Yeah, I don't know. And I will say, I feel we don't get into AI Doom that much. We definitely talk about alignment a lot and concerns a lot. But those are, even if you're not concerned about AI Doom, I think alignment and safety are things that everyone should care about, even if you don't have an X risk kind of mindset. But thanks for the feedback.
No, always appreciate it. The critical feedback is always the best, right? That's how we... Wait, hold on. Let me take that back. Say nice things, everybody. Just say nice things.
Yeah, that 3-star review did hurt our average. So if you want to help out with the 5 stars, I don't know. And a couple others did get an email from Matthias, who has emailed us a couple times with some very nice comments on the episodes. Did mention that it's nice to have Jeremy back as a lively co-host. So
Yay.
There you go. I'm glad people are glad about it.
Ah, shucks, Matthias.
Yeah, and just one more round of acknowledgements. We did get a bunch of comments on YouTube where we are now posting the recordings of this with our faces. So if you somehow are interested in that, you can go there. I might even start including more kind of screenshots and whatnot. Couple nice, helpful comments there saying it's hard to find our names because they're not in the descriptions of the episodes. Okay, that's going to be there now, including also a link to our Twitters if you somehow want to follow and see all the AI memes I retweet every day. Yeah, and a lot of comments on there, so thank you for the YouTube audience. And if you do like your podcast on YouTube, feel free to go on over and subscribe and and all that sort of stuff.
Amazing. Thank you, YouTube comments. I never thought I'd say that, but...
Yep. All right. And starting with the tools and apps section, the first news story is KLING is the latest AI video generator that could rival OpenAI's Sora. So this is coming from the Chinese tech company Curation. And yes, there's a new AI video generation model that produces videos up to 2 minutes long at HD resolution and 30 frames per second. And just from looking at them, seems to be the closest to Sora that we've observed so far. There are a lot of other competitors out there like Pika in the US, but the videos they generate are still not quite as high resolution or smooth looking. And the general impression in response to this has seemed to be that this is sort of one of the most impressive outings. And this is now available as a public demo in China. So yeah, exciting progress in video generation.
Yeah, well, the fact that it's a public demo in China also makes it very different from Sora, right? Which is still very much under wraps. And that makes it really hard to get a good head-to-head comparison. This is something a lot of people have commented on. There was an article we talked about on the podcast before about just the difficulty in practice of actually using Sora to make those videos that showed up on OpenAI's launch website and all the press. It's unclear how good Sora really is. And ironically, we might actually have a better sense of how this model is just because it is more publicly available. we don't know much about it, right? So I went on their website to kind of see what information I could gather. They do, it is, by the way, all in Chinese, so I had to hit Google Translate. But apparently Kuaishou has, which is the company behind it, has stood up this thing that Google Translate thinks is called the big model team. Maybe that's large model team, but basically you get the idea. They say a lot of things there about like how custom this architecture is. Really, it seems to be, they're claiming, something that they themselves have designed. So when you read the description of it, there are a lot of themes that come up that do sound like at least they rhyme with what OpenAI's Sora can do. You know, they're using a diffusion transformer. They talk about this whole space-time encoding that they're doing. Again, very similar to what we heard in the context of Sora. So it seems certainly inspired or related to technically the Sora model, but they do claim that this is a new kind of special architecture that they've set up. Worth noting too about the company itself. This is, so the model of course is called KLING, or you might prefer calling it KLING. Sorry, that was like, okay. Kuaishou itself though is a company that a lot of people haven't heard of in the West. It is basically a competitor to TikTok, essentially the like Chinese TikTok. And as a result, so they do these short videos. So by the way, in China, TikTok is actually called Douyin. So that's sort of their immediate competitor. They have a mobile app. It's all about sharing short videos and all that stuff. And so it makes sense that they're diving into this space. They have gotten a lot of funding from the China Internet Investment Fund, which is it's a state-owned enterprise controlled by the Cyberspace Administration of China. The important thing here is that they actually have what's known as a golden share ownership stake in the company, in Kuaishou. Golden share ownership is this thing that the Chinese state uses. Basically, there are special shares that allow them to exercise voting control, to outvote all other shares of other shareholders under certain circumstances. So in China, this is often used for the state to exercise de facto control over an entity. I mention that to say that what we're looking at when you talk about Kuaishou, you really are talking about a company that is under an unusually high degree of state control. So kind of worth noting when you think about this kind of very new and important player in the generative AI space, this is a company that has a pretty significant stateside footprint.
Right. And I'm going to try and just show off some examples. We'll see if it works. But just looking at the videos they have shared, or at least some of them, my observation is it's not quite as good as Sora. It's pretty obviously AI generated. So you see a lot of artifacts and whatnot. Still quite good, especially in terms of the consistency part, where it seems sort of physically realistic. There's less noise. So definitely impressive, but it's still the case that nothing out there has been quite as good as Sora. So OpenAI really ahead of the game on just about everybody still. And I'm sure it is just a matter of time, but somehow no one has quite managed it yet.
It's true. Yeah, it is always hard to tell how cherry-picked again the Sora videos are because it's a little bit more proprietary. But you're right; it does seem to be kind of lower quality. They did show some of those examples of a knife going through some fruit or something and actually cutting it, right? And the effect of the cut staying in the video. So people have used that to argue that it is in fact capturing something. That sort of physical simulation argument that we heard with Sora. Is this model actually able to simulate physics? That there's some stickiness to that argument here for sure, but it does seem to be early days. It also may improve quickly, right? So one of the things that they highlight is it's a self-developed model architecture. That's what they claim on their website. They claim they also have their own scaling law that they've developed for this model, right? So this might suggest that more scale, more compute, more data. Maybe we can see this start to reach Sora levels if the company can actually get their hands on those processors, which of course is a challenge given they're in China.
Next up, Apple Intelligence will automatically choose between on-device and cloud-powered AI. So we have known for a while that Apple is going to talk a whole bunch about AI at an upcoming event at WWDC 2024. And we have started to hear a preview of what's coming from various sources. So can't really for sure know if this is happening, but most likely these summaries are probably going to include a lot of what's there. And this one is going to have, apparently this new AI systems of theirs will be called Apple Intelligence, and it will be integrated across the iPhone, iPad, and Mac devices. It will provide better AI features and will have a ChatGPT-like chatbot powered by OpenAI. And it'll be focused more on that sort of functionality, less on image or video generation. It sounds like there's also going to be a lot of details with regards to privacy and security. So it will not be building user profiles based on what you do with it, somewhat in contrast to Microsoft, which had their whole recall thing recently. So yeah, we're starting to see Apple coming out with a new kind of slightly different strategy compared to its competitors, and we'll be sure to cover it in more detail when this event does happen.
Yeah, apparently there's a Bloomberg report as well earlier saying that Apple is not planning on forcing users to use these new AI features. It's going to be opt-in, which is in contrast to a lot of the AI features we've seen in the past on different platforms where, you want to default people to using it. So that'll be kind of interesting. One of the big questions obviously is you're at Apple, right? So we're talking about a product with a brand that's built around security. So to the extent that you're planning on sending, data off device to be processed on a server somewhere, what this is talking about, that raises some security concerns. And there have been reports that say that Apple may choose to focus on using their own M2 chips in data centers that have a secure enclave, basically just to make sure that the data that's processed remotely is as secure as it would be on device. That's the argument that they may try to make. So anyway, this is all part of that calculus, right? How much do you do on device versus how much do you offload? There's, for the moment, and this may pass, as algorithms get more efficient, but for the moment, that is the language in which the trade-off between user experience and security is being expressed, right? You can either have, the super secure on-device computations happen, it'll be a little bit slower and more constrained, or you can have faster responses, lower latency, but, use a server somewhere where you have to send your data. So that is kind of the balance Apple's going to have to strike, and we'll see what they end up choosing. It'll tell us a lot about what it means to do secure AI. For a brand like Apple, they certainly are going to sort of lead the way with that.
On to lightning round. First story, Udio introduces new Udio 130 music generation model and more advanced features. So Udio is one of these text-to-music services. In fact, it is the one we use to make our end of episode song every week, and I've grown to quite like it. And usually they offer the ability to generate 30-second chunks of music based on a text description. And the announcement here is that this new model will be able to generate 2 minutes of audio and will also be better, more coherent and structured. And along with this, there are also some new advanced controls like random seeds, keywords, lyrics intensity, a whole bunch of stuff that they're adding to have more control over the generation. So yeah, I think these types of text-to-music tools are advancing pretty rapidly, and this is currently only available to Pro subscribers, but apparently it is going to be rolled out more widely soon.
Yeah, I find it so interesting to see all these new settings are being introduced, these new affordances. Like what are the knobs that you need in order to tweak your interaction with some of these AI-powered tools? The random seed one is really interesting, right? Because if you actually build AI systems, you see this all the time. It's how do you make sure that you have the ability to, although you're generating, outputs with a certain amount of randomness baked in, how do you make sure you can reproduce a specific output maybe that you generated earlier or a specific aspect of it? That's this random seed setting. It allows you to basically make the generation process a little bit more repeatable. So essentially, if there's some characteristics that you really liked about a song, maybe, I don't know, the beat or the lyrics or something that you want to preserve into your next generation, even if other things like the lyrics might change, then you can do that. That gives you a little bit more control. So it's kind of interesting. We're seeing this explosion of different, knobs and buttons that we want to put in users' hand so that their interaction with these tools have the affordances that users will turn out to really like. So anyway, I think part of that ongoing journey that we're all on together as we discover what generative AI user experience really needs to look like.
Next up, Perplexity AI's new feature will turn your searches into shareable pages. So this new feature is Perplexity Pages, and it will create well-formatted web pages for their search queries. Perplexity AI, in case you don't know, is a company that is essentially AI-powered search. You can query something, the AI or the tool will find a bunch of relevant web pages and use a large language model to summarize them. And previously, it just sort of output ChatGPT-esque answer to you, and this feature will let you output sort of like a Wikipedia page kind of thing. It will be much more aesthetically pleasing, and you can then share it. So it seems to be like going more towards the idea that people use this to generate reports or things that they'll share with others, which they already have to some extent. You can like share a link to your search to others, but moving more in that direction.
Yeah, it definitely feels like one strategic direction this could lead to is kind of, generative internet, where you're a little bit further away from the actual, web page content that's sort of organically been written by human beings, at least for the most part. So it kind of, it makes me wonder strategically, how precarious is the position of the average, blogger or data source, website on the internet if there's now going to be an intermediary layer of generative AI that just takes that, treats it as raw material, and converts it into something that is more specifically designed for a particular user query. No idea where that goes, obviously, but that's a really interesting direction for Perplexity to be pushing in. And we think about what it's going to take to actually compete with Google, which is Perplexity's game plan. Yeah, that's a kind of interesting and plausible direction. I guess we'll have to see how that plays out.
Next, ElevenLabs AI generator makes explosions or other sound effects with just a prompt. So ElevenLabs, the company that has so far focused primarily on voice synthesis from text, now has a new AI tool for sound effects. It can generate up to 22 seconds of sounds, and that can then be combined on their platform with voices or actually apparently music. And it sounds like they collaborated with Shutterstock to build the library and train on their audio clips, meaning that this perhaps is a bit safer to use than other things that haven't used necessarily licensed data. This tool is free to use, but you do have to pay for commercial license to be able to use it and, of course, have various perks.
Yeah, and it's definitely not the first, but it more noise in the space. More noise in the space of noise. There are a lot more companies working on this whole text to sound space, right? We had Stability, right? Stability released stable audio. Yeah, stable audio last year. And yeah, essentially that's about audio clips for music and sound effect. And then there was also Meta's AudioCraft, which can generate sound like background noises and things like that. So definitely a lot of movement in this space, in this noise space. And yeah, I mean, kind of interesting strategic positioning too. Again, we're back to that whole question of the generative AI internet, or the generative internet. When you think about, Shutterstock and like, what is the business model there? If you're just a source of data, eventually they're going to have to try to change their positioning, because it does make them vulnerable to being kind of turned into just like the back end, if you will, for a wrapper that potentially could monetize more effectively.
NotebookLM expands to India, UK, and over 200 other countries. This platform is kind of a way to use their Gemini Pro chatbot. It now supports a whole bunch of interface languages, 108 of them, and also 38 languages for sources and chat. What this NotebookLM thing is sort of more than a chatbot. It is kind of an integrated UI to generate summaries of documents and work with things you upload to it. I guess you could think of it as being useful for homework, being useful for business analysis, stuff like that. So maybe less of a well-known tool by them, but indicative that they're continuing to expand access to even this kind of stuff that isn't necessarily a big deal. And onto applications and business, and we begin yet again with OpenAI, who seems to be front of this section every single week. But what can you do This time, the story is that OpenAI is restarting its robotics research group. So back in the day, before GPT-3, before even GPT-1, they at OpenAI used to work on reinforcement learning and used to work on robotics as sort of the two primary initiatives there. So in the first few years, they worked a lot on a video game, on, I think it was Dota, and getting human expert level performance there via self-reinforcement learning. And they also did some work on robotics. Notably, they had this paper on solving a Rubik's Cube with a humanoid arm and training that via a kind of self-bootstrap data collection. That sort of whole side of the company was shut down in 2021. And that was just a bit after GPT-3 came out. And they pretty much completely focused in on the LLM direction. But it does sound like they are starting to work on restarting that part of the company. They are now job posting for research robotics engineer. And on that job posting, it says that they're looking for someone capable of training multimodal robotics models to unlock new capabilities, quote, for our partners' robots. And some other stuff like research and develop improvements to our core models and so on. So definitely kind of initial efforts there, but perhaps not surprising given the overall trend of a lot of work in robotics lately.
Yeah, no, absolutely right that it's unsurprising. It is, very noteworthy how much traction robotics has gotten, especially recently. And OpenAI has actually been kind of right in the middle of this, right? So their in-house startup fund is invested in a bunch of companies that are making a lot of progress. We've talked about these investments, right? We have Figure AI that raised almost $750 million. There was 1X Technologies. Another one I don't think we've talked about, which is Physical Intelligence, but they've invested in a lot of these companies. And when they say you're here to support our partners, you can imagine that's going to be a big part of what they're talking about, right? The companies that the in-house startup fund invested in. We do know that this is a new hire because according to the job posting, it's going to be for, quotes, one of the first members of the team. We know from apparently Forbes that somebody familiar with the matter has said that the group has only existed for about 2 months, so this is certainly very early on. There's been a bunch of hinting at the possibility of this robotics reboot, as the article puts it. There was a press release in Figure's latest fundraise kind of hinted at this. And anyway, a bunch of hinting and sort of gray signals from OpenAI about this. There's, right now a bit of unclarity. There's a bit of murkiness around whether OpenAI is actually planning on developing their own robotics hardware, right? That's really hard. That's a really big challenge. Getting your actuators set up, getting all the sensors, getting all that. They had struggled with that before. So it's possible they're just going to lean into the modeling side of that and the interfaces. We'll see. But ultimately, it may also be positioned to compete with some of its own partners. We've certainly seen them do that in the past, right? As, for example, ChatGPT and other models start to increase their capability surfaces and gobble up what used to be startups that were just wrappers around the weaker versions of ChatGPT. That may happen with robotics platforms. It's hard to know, but certainly this suggests OpenAI is looking very, very closely at this whole space. And they're poaching, by the way, they're competing for the same small pool of talent that a lot of their partners are competing for. So at least in that sense, it's not strict collaboration. There's a little bit of potential for friction there too.
Yeah, it does seem like they have a bit of a hint here as far as their strategy. In particular, Forbes did say they have 2 sources that told them that OpenAI intends to coexist rather than compete against companies that build the hardware, especially their partner companies, and that they intend to build technology that the robot makers will integrate into their own systems. And that seems to be collaborated or confirmed by the job posting that says that people hired for the position would be tasked with collaborating with external partners as well as training AI models. And this is coming a few months after there was an announcement, particularly not just investment, but of Figure partnering with OpenAI. And the announcement there was that Figure would use ChatGPT and OpenAI's models to be part of the intelligence of their humanoid robot. So to me, this sounds like pretty much kind of hiring some talent to strengthen that partnership and enable it, rather than really going back to what we were doing as far as doing some research with in-house hardware and so on. Next, Saudi fund invest in China effort to create rival to OpenAI. This is about being an investor in GPT4 AI. I believe we've already covered that, and they very much do aim to build an OpenAI rival. And according to this report, Prosperity 7, which is part of the state-owned oil group Saudi Aramco, is participating in a funding round for that company as a minority investor. So, not necessarily a major owner of this, but they are investing there. And GPT AI is already said to be the largest generative AI startup in China by staff numbers, but has mainly been relying on local investment and government support. So yeah, I think definitely you have more understanding of implications here, Jeremy, but I imagine given the US-China tensions, this will have some implications.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, so one of the things they highlight is that this is the only foreign investor in the country's efforts to create a homegrown rival to OpenAI, which is in this case GPT4, which is the company that's being funded. So really, this is the first time China's been able to wrangle an investor to do this. Why is this the first time? Well, one reason is that the US has made it very clear that they don't want sort of sovereign wealth funds and other venture funds from any part of the world, really, that they can prevent from doing this, to invest in Chinese AI companies. We saw the tension, for example, with a lot of the UAE companies, sort of like G42 stuff, around whether or not to base servers in the United Arab Emirates and all that stuff, and the pressure the US has been applying there. Partly, in fact, that had a connection to China as well, because there was a concern over possible ties there. So in this case, I think that's what you're seeing. China's sort of been forced to rely on domestic investment, and that's taken the form in many cases of the nation state apparatus directly investing through various funds. So this is really an injection of fresh capital. Kind of an interesting alignment here between Saudi Arabia and China. One of the things, though, that the article does highlight is, the Saudis are certainly feeling Washington's pressure as well. So the chief executive officer of Alat, who is involved in this deal, says that, look, I would divest from China if I was forced to do so. Making it really clear, like, look, we have to find a way to partner with Washington. And the signal is pretty clear. If the hammer comes down, if there's enough pressure from Washington, even deals like this could fall through. And that's quite important because, we've seen already the whole ecosystem around GPT4 in particular. There are other kind of competitors to them in China, companies like Moonshot AI, Minimax, 0.1.AI, which we've talked about their Yi series of models before. These are really important companies. They've been dependent on government funds and large local cloud providers as well, companies like Huawei, to fund their growth because there's no external capital pouring in. You've got companies or investors rather, like SoftBank and Tiger Global that, in other countries like India would come in and make those investments, but they just haven't. They've been staying on the sidelines through this push, again, because of all that pressure. So, this is, I think, a sign of, frankly, the success of the US policy in dealing with China to date, kind of frustrating those attempts to raise money other than through domestic means. And yeah, we'll have to see. But one of the interesting things too is the valuation here is, I believe, GPT4 being valued at about $3 billion. So, that's starting to get pretty decent, at least. It's a $400 million investment. Hard to buy that much AI hardware. If the play here is to be the Chinese OpenAI, look, OpenAI is sitting on investment sums on the order of like $20 billion. 400 million is not even, scratching the surface of that kind of investment. In a world where scaling dominates, which seems to be the world that we're in, this is just really tough. This is a successful stifling, as far as I can tell, of domestic efforts in China to push their advanced AI research agenda.
And on to the lightning round, we have kind of a related story. First up, UAE seeks marriage with US over artificial intelligence deals, and marriage is in quotes. This is coming from the Financial Times, and it is based on some quotes from Umar Sultan Al Olama, the UAE's AI minister.
Dude, you crushed that.
Just gotta go into confidence. And so in this interview, this person said that there's a deal in the works in which Microsoft purchased a 1.5 billion stake in the Abu Dhabi-based AI firm G42. And this would be one of many collaborations between the UAE and the US. There's this quote, now you're going to see the outcomes of that marriage, if I'm going to use that word, between both G42 and Microsoft, but also the UAE and the United States. So yeah, very much a related story to what we just said with China. I guess people are picking sides, you could say.
Yeah, and some people are being forced to pick sides. Look, this seems strategically, in some sense, good for the U.S., with a pretty important asterisk, right? So in the context of this whole UAE situation, one thing that's noted in the article and worth flagging, the investment vehicle that the UAE created here that's going to be worth billions of dollars, it's called MGX. And they've been in talks with OpenAI about the chip development plans that OpenAI has. There's been word of, Sam Altman going over to the UAE also to talk about, can we build the next sort of giant data center? And frankly, these are the data centers that when you talk to folks at OpenAI, a lot of them are starting to talk as if the current data center builds, which are the ones that are going to be supporting, let's say, the 2027, 28 training runs. These data center builds internally are believed by many to be the AGI data center. Like, they are talking as if, increasingly the story is coming into focus. We're starting to know, or get a sense of like what the actual infrastructure will be, what the data centers will be that actually train the AGI run. Obviously, they could be wrong about that, but that is an internal belief in many quarters of OpenAI. Why do I say that? I say that because to the extent that we're planning on basing some of these data centers in the UAE for a training run of that magnitude, even if, they're completely off about their predictions, certainly these are going to be models that are hugely capable. These are national security assets that we're talking about. And so, you really want to think about, do you want those training runs to happen there, or is there a U.S. national security imperative to try to onshore that? If you're going to do that, then what you need to do is find a way to deregulate nuclear and natural gas power. There's a great, anyway, we'll get into it later, but there's a great blog post about this published earlier this week by a former OpenAI guy. This is really the thing that's bottlenecking U.S. AI development right now. We don't have the energy infrastructure to build the next data center, or well, we do, but we're getting more and more bottlenecked by that. And that's why we're having to look at other jurisdiction. That's really bad from a national security standpoint. So deregulation of nuclear and other forms of energy like natural gas, really, really important to kind of protect that national security imperative.
Next, Zoox to test self-driving cars in Austin and Miami. Zoox is a self-driving car company. They've been around for a very long time, and for a while now have been owned by Amazon, and they are announcing plans to begin testing in Austin and Miami, in addition to their existing test cities of Las Vegas, San Francisco, and Seattle. And Zoox is a bit different from some of the other companies, Cruise and Waymo. They have a purpose-built robotaxi, which is a vehicle with no steering wheel or pedals and side doors that slide open. But that is not what will be tested. They have a retrofitted kind of normal car that will be tested with safety drivers on board. So they seem to be, kind of a fair deal behind still Cruise and Waymo in terms of trying to push things out there. But to me, this is still very interesting just because Waymo is already offering this as a commercial service. They are expanding to LA and trying to expand kind of seemingly pretty rapidly. Cruise is seeking to come back and start offering things publicly again in the near term. So this whole robot taxi, area seems to be likely to be really hitting the ground in the next year or two, to me. Like, I think we'll start seeing robotaxis a lot more in the coming year or two.
Andre, are you trying to say that the rubber is going to start to meet the road?
I think so. I think that is an appropriate way to describe it.
I too think it's an appropriate way to describe. Yeah, sorry, that's terrible. Yeah, no, it seems really interesting. I'm always sort of amused by it. Like, we try to follow the space really closely. It's the podcast, among other reasons, and mostly, at least for me, it's the other reasons. I had not been tracking Zoox or their progress, so it's really interesting to see there's yet another player in this space. They do seem to have a testing protocol that apparently is somewhat distinctive. They're saying that they first start by looking at some specific pre-planned route. They're designed to be especially challenging, like challenging scenarios come up a lot, driving features. And then they also do some random testing of point-to-point route within a certain geofence. And so their rollout is going to start with the kind of focused testing area, the areas that have been geofenced, and then expand out from there. I'm not sure if this is actually standard. It seems from this article that it isn't. So I'd be curious if that turns out to be like a better play. But anyway, good for Zoox. Kind of interesting. We'll see if they end up taking off.
Next story, Microsoft lays off 1,500 workers and apparently blames, quote, AI wave. A little bit more detail here. They're laying off between 1,000 and 1,500 workers from its Azure cloud and mixed reality departments. And according to the story, Jason Zender, an executive vice president of some stuff at Microsoft, stated in an email that the layoffs align with the company's long-term vision and strategy for AI. So, maybe a little bit overstating how this is blamed on the AI wave, at least explicitly, but capturing a bit of a trend that's been going on for a while within tech more broadly of a lot of layoffs since like 2 years ago, and increasing focus and moving of funds towards AI from other parts of these big, giant companies. And this is just reaffirming that.
Yeah, it's true. It's hard not to miss the parallel here with Meta, right? This is in large part a reorg that is swapping people on the metaverse side or the kind of augmented reality side to the AI side, right? So kind of interesting that trend. One hype wave maybe giving way to another, though arguably the AI wave isn't quite hype. One of the things that people often chalk this stuff up to too is just systemic overhiring, right? We just came out of a period of time where interest rates were super low. Companies were hiring like gangbusters. The stocks were going through the roof. Now things may be cooling off just a little bit. That may be part of this, but it's 1,500 highly technical workers, maybe worth taking note of. So there was a very dry statement written by this guy, Jason Zander, who's EVP of Strategic Missions and Technologies at Microsoft. He sent an email out and was saying that, quote, "Our clear focus as a company is to define the AI wave and empower all our customers to succeed in the AI, and I'm bored." Basically, it's this long thing, and it's all bureaucratic speak. No real information contained in there. 1,500 people gone, basically, AI wave. Maybe, maybe not.
Do you want to skip these next two stories? I think.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think these are not super important. And we can...
I think the Elon one might be, but I think we can skip it anyway.
It's a pledge. Well,
no, but it's an Elon pledge. It's definitely going to happen.
Exactly. And one last story for the section. The title is Avengers Assemble. Google, Intel, Microsoft, AMD, and more team up to develop an interconnect standard to rival Nvidia's NVLink. So there you go. They have formed this Ultra Accelerator Link Promoter Group to develop a new interconnect standard for AI accelerator chips. And they want this to be an open standard that allows multiple companies to develop AI hardware using the new connection, similar apparently to Intel's Compute Express link. And it seems like this article goes into a lot of technical detail, or at least some. This is expected to be based on something that AMD has with their Infinity architecture. So yeah, you're seeing, a lot of companies want some alternatives to Nvidia, as you would expect.
Yeah, that's definitely the desperate play here. We've seen this in almost every dimension of what Nvidia does. Some combination of like Google, AMD, Intel, Meta, Microsoft, they're all trying to and Broadcom, will try to chip away at the different things that make the NVIDIA ecosystem what it is. Look, NVLink is a big part of that. You can think of it alongside the CUDA, CUDA ecosystem. You can think of it alongside, the actual chips themselves. It's all a package that makes NVIDIA this very sticky environment. So this is another big push. Like all things in hardware, we are talking about the distant future. That's unavoidable, right? So when you look at this interconnect play, yes, it's about setting up a new standard that would be open source, right? By contrast to the closed source approach that NVIDIA is taking with their NVLink setups. But ultimately, this is going to take a while to hit the market. Apparently, it's going to be in the next 2 years, really, before there is any kind of new interconnect tech that's actually baked into any products that you could use or buy. So NVIDIA still has some time to take advantage of that head start. So not going to be hitting the market anytime soon.
And on to our projects and open source section. And we begin with a new open source model coming from Zoox AI, which we were just talking about earlier. The model is GLM49B. And so this is, pretty much like a ChatGPT-esque model. So they have this GLM49B. They also have GLM49B-chat, which is aligned to human preferences to be better. And they also have a variant with a context of 1 million tokens. So a few variants of this model over here. They say that it supports 26 languages. There's also a multimodal variant of this. They say pretty good in evaluations, as you might expect. In fact, seemingly better than some models like Mistral, although pretty behind the frontier models. I think, added to a stack of models in that 8, 7, 9 billion range that we've been seeing.
Yeah, open source, by the way, underrated as a geopolitical battleground. I'm sorry I'm talking so much geopolitics this episode. I have just been to DC. This is where my head's at.
Yep.
But it is worth noting, like a lot of the models that we've seen from like 0.1.ai, right? Their yeast series of models. I was immediately curious when I saw this thing. I was like, I wonder what the licensing terms are. So I went to the license, and lo and behold, the license is governed and construed in accordance with the laws of the People's Republic of China. Any dispute arising from or in connection with this license shall be submitted to Haidian District People's Court in Beijing. And interestingly, you're told you're not allowed to use the software to engage in any behavior that endangers, quote, national security and unity, endangers social public interests and public order. And as we just heard, the People's Republic of China will determine what that means. So if you're an entity planning on using this, you're effectively operating under the jurisdiction of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a really interesting way of waging a kind of tech warfare, in a sense, where you can tie the kind of licensing models to your sort of geopolitical objectives. That being said, I think this is a really interesting model. It was trained with 10 trillion tokens. So there are a couple of different versions of it. You've got the base model, which is a 9 billion parameter model. By the way, they say this is the open source version of the latest generation of models they've got. So that might imply that there are additional closed source versions too that aren't being released. But they have that base model, the 9 billion parameter model. There's a chat version of it. So presumably this is a dialogue and perhaps instruction fine-tuned version. This one is interesting. It's called GLM49 billion chat. This one's really interesting because it includes a bunch of features that have been trained into it specifically for web browsing, code execution, custom tool calls, so function calling, like baked into the model. Really interesting. And long text reasoning. It's got a context, this one, of 128,000 tokens. So pretty impressive. And it compares favorably, they claim, to Llama 3 8B in a whole bunch of things, mathematical reasoning, coding, general knowledge, and all that stuff. And I have heard that it apparently works better on low resource languages, rarer languages, for which you have less training data, than even Llama 3 70B. So that's a much, much bigger model. And you have here a model that seems to outperform that. There's also a chat variant, by the way, with a 1 million token context window again, like this is an open source model with a 1 million token context length. That is about 2 million Chinese characters for those of you keeping up at home. And I looked at the eval data on this one, that needle in a haystack test, that all interesting needle in a haystack test where you plant a fact somewhere in a giant prompt that you're going to feed the model. This is often used for these long context window models. And you're going to test the model's ability to recover that fact, right? So you mention like, my favorite color is red, somewhere in the middle of all of Shakespeare. And you're going to ask the model, what is my favorite color? And see if it can recall it. Well, it basically nails the needle in a haystack test across the entire token context. So no matter where in that input you place that nested fact, it's gonna pull it up with almost 100% recall. So that's pretty impressive. The last model is this GLM4V9B. That's a multimodal model. So it's got vision as well, just an 8,000 token context window. But this one was a little wild. It actually seems to outperform in a whole bunch of different evals, models that include Claude 3 Opus, GPT4 Turbo, at least the version that was back in April, and Gemini 1.0 Pro. Like, this is really, really impressive. We're going to wait to see, obviously, what the actual kind of open benchmarking looks like when people actually take this to Hugging Face. But for now, these results seem really, really impressive, especially on like the long context window oriented evaluations like Long Bench. This thing seems to do really well, even compared to absolutely top of the line model like Gemini 1.5 Pro, like Claude 3 Opus. So Opus rather. So really impressive result. But as ever, if you're going to build on top of this, keep an eye on that license because that is some exposure.
It's a little bit more restrictive than some of our licenses we've covered. And next up, Hugging Face and Pollen Robotics show off their first project, an open source robot that does chores. So just recently, we talked about how Hugging Face has started working on open source robotics. In particular, they launched this LeRobot repository that is a software offering that kind of provides a unified API to a lot of data sets, a lot of things you need to do robot control, and so on. Now there's a new initiative there called Ricci 2, a humanoid robot designed by Pollen Robotics, and it is from an open source robot company that is based in France. So I guess we have more French AI being shown off here. And this Ricci 2 robot has apparently been trained to perform various household chores and interact safely with humans and pets. It's a kind of pretty cute looking robot. Doesn't look super humanoid, not as advanced as something like, what Tesla has or Figure has, so on. They say that they teleoperated it to collect data and then had it be able to do some of these tasks on its own, like taking an object and moving it around and so on. So yeah, I think very interesting. Hugging Face is a huge, very influential company, so exciting for me to see them continuing to push in this direction.
Yeah, apparently Ricci 2 going to be coming soon. So, that's what the website says anyway, and supposedly going to be a big leap forward. That piece about the teleoperation too is really interesting. Makes me think a little bit of, what's that company? Geordie Rose's company there? Sanctuary AI, right? We've talked about them before. That approach that they're taking as well of using teleoperation, like humans wearing VR headset to actually train these models to imitate, like through imitation learning, what they're doing. And it's an interesting question as to whether that's the thing that takes off, or whether, something more like LLM grounded or some combination ends up being the way. But definitely an interesting next step. The product that they have, their so-called flagship product, Ricci 1, does seem also pretty cheap. Looking at these prices, I mean, about $10,000 for the cheapest version with a whole bunch of augmentations that you can make and all that stuff. So kind of interesting, bit of a DIY play, almost like a Raspberry Pi for humanoid robotics, but we'll see if it takes and if it ends up being the way.
Yeah, that is very cheap compared to a lot of hardware. You could pay that much just for a single arm, much less than a whole torso or a couple arms.
they sell an ARM for like 10,000 euros.
Yeah.
So if you got 10,000 euros, maybe buy yourself an ARM.
And out of lightning round, first up, we have another story on a dataset. The story is that Zyphra has debuted Zyda, a 1.3 trillion language modeling dataset that it claims outperforms other ones like Pile, C4, and so on. So this is Zyphra technology, and they've created this 1.3 trillion token dataset by combining a bunch of other open datasets like Refined Web, Starcoder, Z4, Pile, a bunch of them. They apparently looked at all these datasets and then deduplicated them, so made sure that kind of all the best parts of all of them are combined and you don't have low quality or kind of copies of data that pollute it. And so, yeah, they've released it now, and they say that when you train on it compared to some of these other open things, your LLMs learn better and do better. So this is a pretty big deal. I mean, having open, very, very large datasets is very important for people to be able to compete with the likes of OpenAI and Anthropic, who have their own internal datasets. Data is super important, almost just as important as compute. So interesting to see some companies continuing to push on that in the open source wars, as we've been, I guess, seeing a lot.
Yeah, that's true. And, when you look at the open source data sets, so many of them start kind of the same way. You've got your standard resources, you got your common crawl, kind of Wikipedia, Google News corpuses, and all this stuff. And so what they're pointing out here is the reason that deduplication was so important is that all of these open source data sets, they all kind of have the common crawl foundation or the Google News Foundation, all that stuff. So they were saying apparently in total, they actually ended up getting rid of about 40% of the initial data set, going from about 2 trillion to, well, the final count of 1.3 trillion in this deduplication effort. So just what it takes, it's not as easy as just combining all those data sets together. You're going to get a lot of duplication and obviously a lot of work to clear those out. So there we go.
And the last story is Stability AI debuts. Why do authors love this word? It's so hard to say. Stability AI has released new stable audio open for sound design. So we just mentioned a bit earlier how Stability AI launched stable audio, and actually Stable Audio 2 was released just a couple of months ago. Well, now they have Stable Audio Open 1.0. So this is the open source variant of it. So you can use it for your own purposes, fine-tuning it. Although apparently this is still available to users under the Stability AI non-commercial research community agreement license. So you still aren't able to use it for commercial activities. And unlike Stable Audio Open is meant for shorter clips, meant for more sound effects, things like that, up to 47 seconds long, and apparently has been trained in a responsible way. So they trained on audio data from Freesound and the Free Music Archive. So there's no copyrighted or proprietary stuff there.
Yeah, and they're, in a bit of a shift from their original model. I think Stability now, ironically, trying to find a stable business model. They've struggled with that in the past. They're now obviously not giving the full open source treatment to this model. It's, non-commercial only, which is, well, anyway, I think a sign of things to come for Stability is they try to figure out how do we monetize? How do we monetize given this AI scaling race, given the insane costs of inference? At a certain point, you're going to need to find a way to not just give, cost of training, I should say, because this isn't about serving, it's about just like open sourcing the models. So yeah, I think, keep an eye on how exactly Stability sets up its licenses going forward, because I think that's going to tell us a lot about the future direction of the company.
And on to the research and advancements section, and we begin with a pretty exciting piece of research from OpenAI titled Scaling and Evaluating Sparse Autoencoders. This was paired with a blog post from OpenAI titled Extracting Concepts from GPT4. And if I may give my take on it real quick, Just from the outset, I think it has a lot in common with something we discussed a couple of weeks ago from Anthropic. So Anthropic released this blog post titled, I think, Mapping the Mind of a Large Language Model or something like that, along with a very long paper. In that paper, they trained an autoencoder on the outputs of a bunch of units in a large language model and showed how when you train this secondary model that essentially compresses the outputs of a bunch of the neurons, you can find that some of those compressed representations correspond to very interpretable features. And famously, there was a Golden Gate feature where some set of activations corresponded to the Golden Gate Bridge, and there was some fun stuff that Anthropic did with that. Well, now we have this research from OpenAI, which really is, to me, seems very similar from a technical perspective. They have slightly different approaches. They use a sparse autoencoder, but the basic aim here is the same. Take some outputs from the large language models, train a compression of it to be able to interpret, to, as they say, extract concepts from GPT-4. And they actually say that they use this approach to find 16 million features in GPT-4. Things like, apparently, features related to human imperfection, a rhetorical question, various things like that. And in addition to the research, they also released some code for doing this sort of training and interactive feature visualizations, similar to what Anthropic also released. So interesting to see these lines of research coming out close together. I think very likely just both of the companies were working on it in parallel because this was not, let's say, entirely novel, or there was a lot of work leading up to this. But as with the Anthropic paper, personally, I think this is really exciting. We are seeing some very nice interpretability and alignment possibilities out of this research. So yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, you're very right about the, I mean, even down to the sparse autoencoders, in fact, Anthropic's done a lot of research on those specifically. So this is, in a sense, it's like OpenAI doing, like, taking a page out of the Anthropic playbook to a certain degree, but doing very interesting scaling experiments with these autoencoders. Before we get into it, a political note here. So if you look at the author list, there are two people on the team who are no longer at OpenAI, and that's Ilya Sutskever and Jan Laika. Jan Laika, formerly one of the heads of the super alignment team, along with Ilya, he has gone over to Anthropic, we recently learned, right? So it really is, now it's very much an Anthropic sort of line of effort. This seems to have been their last big piece of work, their last salvo before they were taken out into the back alley and shot, or just moved out. I don't know.
Let's say left on good terms, okay? Let's not...
Left on excellent terms.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have here that, of course, is a joke. We don't advocate for violence on the podcast, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to, be on YouTube. Okay, so a couple things about this whole autoencoder setup. So the way it works fundamentally, imagine that you have a big giant blob of neurons and activations of those neurons, right? That's what goes on in deep learning. You would love to find a way, like there's probably a better way, smaller, more efficient, more compact way of representing all of that. You could probably compress that. Think of it literally like a zip file. Find a way to compress that, represent it with fewer numbers, right? Instead of all the neurons, all the activations of all those neurons, maybe we could come up with a shorter list of numbers that captures the same meaning. And that's what autoencoders do, right? So you're going to take this giant mess, this giant blob of numbers that is your neural network, and you're going to try to encode that in a lower dimensional vector. And the way you train your autoencoder is you're going to compress your neural network representation and then try to reconstruct them from that same small set of numbers, right? So that you can call the dimensionality of the autoencoder n, right? And only a small subset of the entries in that autoencoder are going to be allowed to be non-zero. That's what makes it a sparse autoencoder. So you have a small list of numbers. In fact, even though that list of numbers is small, the vast majority of them are forced to be zero. So only an even smaller number of numbers in that list is actually allowed to be non-zero, to contain information. And that is really important because having a smaller set of numbers makes it a lot more interpretable. you can build models on top of that representation to make predictions, for example, about, hey, is there a concept that is being captured in my kind of latent, my shorter autoencoder vector? And that kind of allows you anyway to do some interesting interpretability. There's a whole bunch of detail in here. I read the paper with great interest. I think it's worth looking at if you're technical. The long and the short of it is they explore a lot of interesting ideas around the scaling properties of these autoencoders, right? So how, for example, does the size, the dimensionality of the autoencoder have to change as you increase the size of the model that you're trying to model, to compress, if you will, right? So unsurprisingly, the larger the model is, it turns out the larger the autoencoder dimensionality has to be if you want to achieve the same loss. And then you can ask a separate question, how then should the number of non-zero numbers within the autoencoder scale? That's a separate scaling question. They go into that too. They derive a bunch of really interesting scaling laws. And anyway, we could go on forever on this, but maybe I'll just park this by saying the last piece, which is metrics are really hard in this space. It's really hard to figure out what is the metric that measures how good your autoencoder actually was, because it is meant to capture meaning, right? It's meant to allow you to interpret what's going on in your network, but there's no number that you can easily turn to that captures that meaning. Like, well, the number that you have is the reconstruction loss. So how much, let's say how much accuracy you lose when you reconstruct, when you rely on that compressed version of your autoencoder to reconstruct the original full model. So how faithful is that reconstruction to the original? That's one number that you can measure. That's what you actually use to train the autoencoder. You try to minimize that distance, but that's not really what you care about. What you care about is things like, does this autoencoder actually recover features that we think it should have, right? Does it capture the idea of a car, right? Or the idea of running? And they explore metrics that can kind of detect that or capture that. And then, how much performance do we sacrifice if we use only the parts of the model that it can interpret? So if you just look at the interpretable bits of the autoencoder and only use those as information used to reconstruct the model, how much performance sacrifice? These are all really interesting technical questions. They're all in the weeds. We could spend an hour on this paper, but unfortunately we can't. Highly recommend checking it out if you're into the whole interpretability space.
Yeah, a lot in this paper. And just to reiterate, I guess, I think these approaches are starting to challenge a little bit the notion that we have no idea what's going on inside these models, right? This is a commonly stated thing. I think you said it in your Joe Rogan appearance even. But with these sorts of visualizations or condensed interpolate features, we can at least detect some of what's going on and steer it, as we saw with the Anthropic thing, where if you find a feature that deals with drugs, you can literally at inference time set it to 0 so that it gets much harder to jailbreak, to get the model to do things, because you no longer just train the model to avoid certain behaviors. You can detect the behavior at runtime and avoid it. So yeah, very exciting. One more technical detail is for kind of explaining those features, they build on someone from last year called Neuron to Graph, where you can basically associate a feature with a word or a couple words. So they don't have sort of full explanation. They have a semi-automated way of doing it. And they do provide some fun interactive visualizations as one of the links. So if you're curious, that could be fun to play with. Features like apparently one about humans having flaws and police reports and identification documents, stuff like this. So yeah, if you're going to check out a paper, this one is probably a good one.
Yeah, and I think, to the point of that you rightly raised about, whether this challenges the notion that these things are interpretable. I don't think on Rogan that we ever would have said that, we have no idea what's going on any level in these models.
Right.
But, from the standpoint of the safety implications, unfortunately, this kind of technique isn't it's so nascent, and the scaling properties of it right now, we're not necessarily going to be able to catch up with the scaling of the models. But it's an interesting avenue. And I think it's something that we really want to, you really want to see pursued. That's part of the reason why I'm so excited that Jan Leica finds himself now at Anthropic, where he's going to be doing some of this research. But I think our next paper might be even more to the point of the point you've been making. It's maybe, anyway, we'll get to it, but I think it's almost directly on the nose in terms of how can we better understand and actually control the behavior in a more robust way of these models.
All right, let's get to it. So the next paper is improving alignment and robustness with short circuiting. And yeah, as you said, it's very much related to what we just talked about, where the idea of short circuiting is related to a lot of other approaches we've seen with steering, where essentially you directly interface with a model, you mess with its state at runtime, and so you short circuit its response and its ability to do something harmful rather than having to train it to not do something harmful. You directly kind of impose it on it. And Jeremy, I'm sure you're kind of excited about this, so I'll let you dive into it deeper.
Yeah, did it show? So you're right. It's inspired, right, by this notion of activation engineering. I like that term. This paper uses the term representation engineering, but anyway, sort of same idea. What is that field? Well, that's the field of taking a model, you give it a prompt, and then, of course, the neurons in the model are going to get activated, just like the neurons in the human brain, right? Some of them kind of spike and get excited. You can figure out sometimes which neurons are associated with a given concept. So, for example, the concept of deception, right? Feed the model a bunch of inputs that are associated with deception, see which neurons or groups of neurons consistently light up, and that can give you a hint as to which neurons are involved in that behavior or that concept. And then you can think about doing things like, I don't know, zeroing out those neurons and trying to remove the behavior. It's a very kind of cartoonish way of thinking about it, but that sort of thing actually has been shown to work. This paper is actually not just about interventions at runtime. It's actually about a training process. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start by making two data sets, right? So the first is going to be a data set that's meant to activate the neurons or the representations that are associated with some bad behavior, all right? So think here of, bioweapon design, cyber attacks, deception, all that bad stuff. This is the evil data set, right? The evil data set that we're going to use to activate the evil neurons, right? Very caricaturish. The second data set is going to be the good data set, right? This is a data set that's expected of prompts that are expected to lead to fine, upstanding, decent behavior that you actually want to retain in your model, right? So your regular sort of instruction response prompts, good dialogue, whatever, right? Next, what you're going to do is train the model, and you're going to train it in order to map. So every time it gets inputs in the evil data set, you're going to train it so that the representations you end up with get mapped to random values. Basically, you're just going to completely fuck with the output of the model, train the model to behave completely incoherently when it gets inputs from the evil data set. And the good data set, you're going to try to train it to replicate the original behavior. Just sort of the behavior doesn't change in the model. There are specialized loss functions that they use for this. So, you can think, if you're a bit technical, you can think about trying to, minimize the L2 norm between the random, for the evil data set, you want to kind of minimize the data set, the L2 norm between some random set of activation values weighted by some parameter and your actual kind of trained activations. But anyway, that's just technical detail. This is actually a really interesting paper. It works really well because what you're doing is you're not, unlike fine tuning, you're not training the model to just try to refuse an instruction, right? You're training the model to just completely collapse when asked to display dangerous capabilities. You're actually getting at the actual profound latent capabilities of the model in a deeper way than just sort of adding some fine tuning on top, where you have a model that could help you design bioweapons, for example, but just tries to tell you no, and then it's just a question of when somebody finds the first jailbreak. What you're actually doing in this instance is you are training out in a very aggressive way the capacity, the latent capacity of the model to even do those things. This leads to some really impressive results. Because it's such a robust technique, It allows you to take away bad capabilities from agents as well as multimodal models and standard language models. They see a really dramatic decrease in attack success rates, basically the ability to use these things to do bad things, roughly speaking. Using this technique relative to sort of refusal trained models or models that have special safety prompts, it is a dramatic improvement. And one of the most important things about it is that you don't suffer from the same kind of catastrophic forgetting that you do with a lot of fine-tuning strategies, right? So with a lot of fine-tuning strategies, you're sort of training the model, hey, now that you've been trained on the whole internet to know a bunch of facts, I'm now going to give you some extra training to refuse requests to make bioweapons and bad stuff. Well, that extra training can actually cause you to forget the stuff that you once knew. What this training process does, partly because it's also being trained to remember the skills that it does have through that good data set, it preserves those capabilities while nuking the bad ones. So I thought this was just a really interesting paper. It's another one from Dan Hendricks, who is at the Center for AI Safety, sort of known for a lot of his work on the representation engineering side. Anyway, really interesting result. And more than I think anything I've seen in the last couple of weeks, this is one of those papers that make me go, to your point, Andre, like, this is really starting to give us not just diagnosis, but also treatment for a lot of these sort of extreme risks of misbehavior and weaponization. The challenge, as usual, is what happens when you actually get to the sort of super intelligent domain where all bets are off. But it's still a very impressive, very important result.
Yeah, that's very cool, I think. And it's, to your point, I think it's kind of showing out this, also to you're making progress, with large language models, foundation models. We were at a sort of nascent state with things like alignment, to just say no when you're told to describe how to hack something, right? Well, not too surprising you could jailbreak it and get around it. But these kinds of approaches that are, let's say, the next generation or the next step of basically just make it so a model isn't capable of doing these things seems like kind of the next logical step to take. And I agree that this seems pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's also, just as a last quick note, that's where we start also to move into the domain where it's like, it's not just a technical problem anymore. We have, potentially some techniques that might be helpful for this. It's a policy problem to make sure all the labs that ought to use these things are using these things, right? So that's kind of where the whole policy story becomes inextricably linked with the technical one, but exciting result here, and hopefully we'll see more like this.
And to lightning round, first story is automatic data curation for self-supervised learning, a clustering-based approach. So they say that having just clustering of data on a lot of diverse data to obtain clusters can be used to curate data to sample it for self-supervised learning. And this is one you highlighted, Jeremy, so I'll let you go into more detail on that one.
Yeah, no, for sure. So one of the big challenges anytime you want to make a data set to train your model is getting sort of wide coverage of concept, and ideally a balanced coverage of concept. So, what you'll typically find when you collect a bunch of data is a big lopsided distribution where some topics are a lot more covered than others. And, that can be, for example, if you think about ImageNet, right, this classic data set with 1,000 different image categories, the image of the category of plumber shows up I forget what it is, but it's like some ungodly fraction at the time. So the image recognition systems trained on ImageNet are really, really freaking good at identifying plungers, but that doesn't really map onto the real world. And so when you want to do, for example, in the case of language modeling, you want to collect these big language modeling data sets, you want them to be large. You also want them to be balanced and kind of diverse in that sense. Right? So when you just do a big internet scrape, what you'll find is an awful lot of concepts show up very, very rarely, and then you have a couple of dominant concepts take up a large portion of the data set. So this paper is about figuring out automated ways to balance out that data set. And they, roughly speaking, they use this clustering strategy. If you're in data science or ML, you'll know this, it's k-means clustering. They're basically going to figure out a way to cluster automatically concepts in a way that's balanced. And this is actually kind of challenging because if you just use your standard k-means clustering strategies, what you'll find is you'll get a whole bunch of if you have a concept like, I don't know, rain, right? In the UK or in places where they get a lot of rain, people tend to have a lot of different words for rain. They tend to talk about rain a lot. And so you'll have a whole ton of different nuanced takes on rain. And if you do a standard k-means clustering analysis, you'll end up with a kind of big clusters that are sort of resolved into many small clusters. And so you'll kind of overrepresent. You'll have a bunch of different cluster centroids all around this one topic. So clustering in the conventional sense doesn't really solve your problem. You end up, anyway, whatever, replicating the same problem with your clusters. They use a sort of hierarchical clustering approach where they apply k-means to identify first-level clusters and then apply again until they get a uniform distribution. The math really is a little detailed here, but fundamentally, this is an attempt to deal in an unsupervised, automated way with this problem of rebalancing data sets to make sure that you get a more uniform distribution of concept in that data set for training purposes. That's the idea. There is a lot of math in it. It's kind of hard to describe the geometry of the problem, but if you're interested in data set design, data set curation, development, this is a really good paper to look at because it does seem like something you could use if you're in a small startup. You need to do things in a very efficient, automated way. Yeah, it looks like a pretty interesting strategy to use.
Yeah, and automatic data curation is something that presumably Anthropic, OpenAI, all of them have an approach figured out to, because at the scale you're operating at, it's unthinkable amounts of information and data. And so you have a lot of garbage in there, and you got to find some ways to, as we said, deduplicate, maybe balance the data. So this was just one example of the sorts of things that you might need to do. And one more story. GPT-4 didn't ace the bar exam after all, MIT research suggests. So OpenAI has claimed that GPT-4 scored in the top 10% on the bar exam, but some new research suggests that that figure was skewed towards repeated test takers who had previously failed the exam. So that's where GPT-4 was placing in the top 10%. Apparently, compared to just first-time test takers, GPT-4 scored in the 69th percentile in the top 31%. And yeah, so it's still good, but not quite as good.
Yeah, they paint a pretty nuanced picture of this, and I appreciate this because, this was one of the examples that I would often use, the uniform bar exam, just because sometimes I'd give presentations like lawyers and things like that, and lawyers pay more attention when you talk about understandably their own tests. A bit of nuance here, right? Though the challenge seems to be the tests that OpenAI ran was against a population of test takers where you would sort of expect people who fail the test and are taking it again, they tend to kind of clog up the system and take up a disproportionate fraction of the seats, of the test-taking seat. And so the argument here is going to be, well, you're claiming that it achieved 90th percentile performance, but really it's kind of like it's beating out, a good fraction of first-time test takers, but you've got all these people who kind of suck at the test and are taking it for the millionth time and are never going to pass, and they're, making up rounding out the bottom of the bell curve, right? So when they zero in on just first-time test takers, they find it's like, the 69th percentile, or sorry, 48th percentile for them. And when you adjust more broadly for what they argue is a more calibrated population of test takers, you get the 69th percentile, which, still, like I'm old enough to remember when that was considered really impressive, but still an important adjustment to make here. They go on to argue that the specific areas in which the model performs poorly are the ones that are maybe closest proxies for what a practicing lawyer actually has to do, so the essay writing section in particular. So the argument here is going to be that GPT-4 not only doesn't hit 90th percentile, but the ways in which it fails to hit the 90th percentile are some of the most important for assessing the actual skills and capabilities of a practicing lawyer. So maybe GPT-4 is more like a crappy lawyer, and we don't need to worry about it so much in that sense. One kind of slightly funny thing, there was an email that was sent to OpenAI about this, And in response, there's an OpenAI spokesperson who just referred the publication here, Live Science, to Appendix A on page 24 of the GPT-4 technical report. And the relevant line says, quote, "The uniform bar exam was run by our collaborators at Casetext and Stanford Codex." So really classy way of just throwing the collaborators under the bus. Gotta appreciate that. Well done, OpenAI. It ain't my fault, says OpenAI. And hey, maybe they're right.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's an understandable error. It doesn't seem like maybe they intentionally didn't realize that the population was skewed towards repeat test takers.
Yeah.
It's more of a sort of clarification than calling out OpenAI for overhyping their capabilities, I feel.
Yeah, you're right. It's a nuanced sort of thing that could easily be missed for sure.
And on to policy and safety. And we begin with a story about a former OpenAI researcher who is claiming that we'll have AGI in 2027 and much, much more. So this has been making a bit of a wave across AI commentators and Twitter, users. The former OpenAI researcher in question is Leopold Aschenbrenner. He was a safety researcher and has been kind of around AI safety discourse for a while in general. And the story covers this very long document that he just put out this past week titled Situational Awareness, the Decade Ahead. I think if you read it as a PDF, it winds up being something like 160 pages. And so one of the claims is that we are most likely going to start to see AGI within a few years. It also goes into how we'll likely have superintelligence not too long after that. It has a lot in it, let's just say, given it is 160 pages. And so, yeah, this has fostered a lot of discussion. It has a lot of sort of suggestions or thoughts regarding super alignment, regarding geopolitics, things like that. I'm sure, Jeremy, you took the time to go a little bit deeper into reading it than I have. So, yeah, what was your take or response to this?
Yeah, well, I think, one day I may have more to say about this case in particular, sort of in the back end and what went on there. I think some important details that I can surface publicly, it's like part of the public story here. He was fired for allegedly leaking information from OpenAI. There's a lot of, let's say, there's a lot you could say about the culture of OpenAI and why they chose to leak him. His allegation, certainly, and it seems credible to me based on what I know, his allegation is that, in fact, he was kind of mostly let go for raising a red flag around OpenAI's security practices, which, we conducted an investigation of the security practices at Frontier Labs. I will say broadly, without naming any particular labs, they have deep and profound problems. They are not capable of withstanding exfiltration attacks from nation-state attackers. One of the important points that Leopold was making, or has made, is that you ought to expect at some point these labs to draw the dedicated attention of nation-state cyber attackers who are trying to steal model weights and other controlled, say, insights, like algorithmic insights. I think he's completely right about this. I don't think you have to wait long. I think that the chances that, that important IP has been exfiltrated already are incredibly high. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that. So, this is simply true. The idea of AGI by 2027, 2028, this is consistent with my understanding of OpenAI's own internal expectation about when we're going to be hitting that threshold. They may be wrong, right? OpenAI may easily be wrong. They've certainly done well so far at kind of investing in the space and leading it. So, their opinion probably ought to be taken fairly seriously. And if this happens, again, you get into this question of where are we basing our compute infrastructure? Should we really be building servers in, the UAE that we're planning on using for these massive AGI training runs? That's one kind of part of this whole sort of orbit of thought. But then the other is, what ought we do on the safety and security side for these labs right now? one of the key things is you really got to lock down the algorithmic insights that are being generated in these labs, because those are the things that make the $1 trillion training run of 2027 instead be a $100 billion training run, right? These materially move the needle on different nation states' abilities to pull this sort of thing off. And to the extent that you have these guys just sort of like hanging out in coffee shops and at parties, as they do, and talking about algorithmic insights that should be controlled as they do, that is very, very bad. So, AI is either going to be viewed as a national security issue or it's not. We're either going to get to the point where these are effectively WMD level threats. I think that's likely to happen much sooner than most people think. But, whether that's next year, the year after, or 3 years from now, it's still, very soon. And I think the implication is you just got to get serious about the security situation in these labs. The U.S. national security imperative is here. It may not be widely recognized, but, being late to this really means, given how AI scaling works, being like quite riskily late to this. So, want to get ahead of it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think some of the sections in this long document deal exactly what you've been talking about. One of the titles here is Lockdown the Labs, Security for AGI. There's one for super alignment. There's a section titled The Free World Must Prevail. So very much reiterating, I guess, the point that we should be concerned about China. And yeah, we won't be going too far into this, but I do want to quote from the intro just to get you a feel for what this document is like. So quote, "The AGI race has begun. We are building machines that can think and reason. By 2025 or 2026, these machines will outpace many college graduates. By the end of the decade, they'll be smarter than you or I. We will have superintelligence in the true sense of the word. Along the way, national security forces not seen in half a century will be unleashed, and before long, the project will be on. If we're lucky, we'll be in an all-out race with the CCP. If we are unlucky, an all-out war." So stuff like that, pretty dramatic. Also in the intro, there's this kind of claim, or just another quote, "Before long, the world will wake up, but right now there are perhaps a few hundred people, most of them in San Francisco or the AI labs, that have, quote, situational awareness," and so on. So yeah, very opinionated, long document predicting the future, but I will say, given this is representing someone working at OpenAI, someone working in safety, also pretty representative of what a lot of people kind of think and predict. So worth taking a look if you find that interesting.
Yeah, I gotta say, as somebody who's like, works in national security directly with, folks in the space, this was one of the most cogent, sober-minded assessments of the landscape that I've read, given the level of detail. There are little bits you could quibble with for sure, but in general, the picture that he paints, I think, has a good chance of being accurate. At the very least, it's something we ought to be preparing for. So yeah, kudos to Leopold for putting this together, and I'll certainly be reading his next blog posts.
And next up, a related story. It is that OpenAI insiders warn of a reckless race for dominance. So a group of 9 current and former OpenAI employees have raised the concern about the company's culture and recklessness and secrecy. There's actually an open letter titled "A Right to Warn About Advanced Artificial Intelligence." And in this letter, they have made a few concrete things for advanced AI companies. They say that these companies should not enforce any agreement that prohibits disparagement, that the companies will facilitate a verifiably anonymous process for employees to raise risk-related concerns. The companies will support a culture of open criticism, and that the companies will not retaliate against employees who publicly share risk-related confidential information. So pretty directly tied to, the previous story and also the stories we've seen in recent weeks regarding people leaving and the information about some of the practices at OpenAI in terms of NDAs and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see OpenAI retreat into this very corporate defensive mode. It's very different from the OpenAI we used to see, right? Where Sam Altman would kind of come out in this unprepared way and make these very organic, authentic sounding statements. The response here, and one of the guy who's sort of leading the charge on this, Daniel Kokotayo, sort of longstanding governance researcher at OpenAI, very vocal about the risks here. He said, quote, "OpenAI is really excited about building AGI, and they are recklessly racing to be the first there." I will say a lot of the characterization of the space in general, again, without pointing to particular labs, is absolutely consistent with what we heard in our investigation, speaking to dozens of these whistleblowers and concerned researchers at the labs. You look at the response from OpenAI here, and I mean, I don't know, you tell me how deeply they seem to be engaging with this. Their response is, quote, "We're proud of our track record providing the most capable and safest AI systems and believe in our scientific approach to addressing risk. We agree that rigorous debate is crucial given the significance of this technology and will continue to engage with government, civil society, and other communities around the world." That kind of highly almost political to me sounding line, like, "and we'll continue to do X, Y, and Z." It's like almost like, yeah, okay, screw this. We're going to keep doing whatever we were doing before. I think it's noteworthy too. One thing that's very much lost in a lot of these stories is the backstory that this is about 3 days before our report came out back in March. But around that time, OpenAI came out and said, "Hey, we're setting up an internal whistleblower hotline so that folks can come and, share their concerns internally." Now, the extent to which that was taken seriously by the people in the lab itself, who were in the best position to assess the seriousness with which that offer was being made, presumably, you can kind of gauge that by the fact that all these folks are leaving OpenAI. They're not choosing to go through the whistleblower hotline. They're choosing to reach out to the New York Times. They're choosing to, whistleblow in their own way. This kind of, compounds a lot of the questions, unfortunately, that have been raised about OpenAI since. To what extent is this lab actually serious? Is the leadership actually serious about living up to their publicly stated messaging? There's a lot of concern about this. A lot of this is public. A lot of this, we've run into in the course of investigations, again, regarding, various labs. So it'll be interesting to see if there's actually any movement here. The initial signs from OpenAI don't seem terribly encouraging. It seems very much like business as usual, as far as I can tell. But one last note here, too, is kind of interesting. So they have, that is the folks, the 11 people who all signed this letter pushing for whistleblower protections, they've signed on a pro bono lawyer, Lawrence Lessig. So he's famous for advising Frances Haugen, who's the former Meta employee who famously did her whistleblowing about basically, Meta's putting company profits ahead of safety, the effect that this stuff is having on users, and I think teens in particular and all that. So, this guy has a long history and track record of working in that space. Yeah, it's a really interesting development. It's been a bumpy ride, man, for OpenAI lately, and we'll see if there's actually oversight, right? Because one of the challenges is, yeah, we actually do need whistleblower protections here for these folks. I remember talking to whistleblowers from labs that shall not be named, but a lot of these guys were really concerned that the lab would go after them if they shared, whatever information they might want to with us or with anybody else. And so, this is a sort of thing where clearly the culture of the space needs to change. It needs to be much more open. We need to have more robust conversations, especially when the people who know the most about the safety and security situation are the most concerned.
That's right. The article title says OpenAI insiders. Worth noting, there are 2 signatories also from Google DeepMind and 1 person who was an Anthropic. Also, 6 of the signatories are anonymous. The ones that are currently OpenAI are all anonymous. There's also a couple anonymous formerly OpenAI. So there you go. It's clear that even the signatories are a bit concerned about blowback from this.
Yeah.
Next up, testing and mitigating elections-related risks. So this is about a process called policy vulnerability testing that is a process that involves a very in-depth qualitative testing that, pretty much involves mitigating election-related risks. And once again, I'm going to just hand over on to Jeremy to go into detail on this one.
Yeah, sir. So this is a post from Anthropic. They're basically coming out and saying, look, elections coming up. We've got all these models. We've got Claude 3, all the different Claude 3 models. We've got Claude 2, blah, blah, blah. We want to make sure they don't get misused. And so here is our strategy. So in a sense, this is sort of a call to all the labs, really, to come out with their own election interference strategies. It's a 3-stage process, their pipeline, that is, that they lay out here. The first is exactly what you said. It's policy vulnerability testing. This involves bringing in external experts to start by figuring out at a high level, like, what are all the misuse applications that we can imagine wanting to test for, and then sort of like iterating on those tests with experts. This is a manual process that is very time-consuming and intensive. Then their second step is coming up with ways to scale and automate those evaluations. And that's important just because, once you have the core ideas you want to test for, there's no possible way that you'll manually, with human work, get all the tests that you might want generated to test all the different ways that the system could be used offensively. So essentially, this is a nice, consistent, scalable, and comprehensive way to audit the risk set. And then the last step is implementing the actual mitigation for these risks. They call out a bunch that they've discovered over the process of going through this cycle. The first is, obviously changing Claude's system prompt, right? This is kind of the meta prompt that Claude uses to kind of decide what it should output, what it shouldn't, how it should behave. There's augmenting fine-tuning data, so maybe fine-tuning out certain capabilities or behaviors, their usage policy, and then automated review tools to check user prompts as they come in and make sure that they're not trying to prompt the system for dangerous stuff. Anyway, and so on and so forth. Basically, this is Anthropic just trying to be a little bit more open about what their strategy has been so far. It all, kind of makes sense. It's a policy meets technical paper. If you're interested in election interference and all that stuff and what the emerging standard practices are, this is definitely a paper to check out.
And one more paper related to safety. This one is teams of LLM agents can exploit zero-day vulnerabilities. So zero-day vulnerabilities are hacks that are essentially unknown, that, when you release a product, the zero-day means that it's unknown to the company. As far as I understand, maybe there's a more nuanced way to say it. But we've talked before about how LLMs were shown to be capable of exploiting such vulnerabilities when given a description of it. And what this paper shows is that it's possible to get better performance on tackling unknown zero-day vulnerabilities by this team approach of having different agents. So they have, I guess, specialties of different aspects of what you would do during hacking. So task-specific expert agents. And then there's a planner and manager, a whole bunch of details. But the gist of it is once you do this, there's significantly better capability to actually do successful hacking with, I guess, pass rates going up to around 60-ish% compared to if you try and do this with just one LLM without describing the vulnerability.
Yeah, no, that's it. And I think this is really an important waypoint in the story of AI capabilities. Yeah, I remember having conversations with people like 2 months ago about, they'd say stuff like, well, I'll worry about, AI risks of various kinds when an AI system can actually do a cyber attack. They really can't, right? And one of the interesting things about this is, so 6 weeks ago, we discovered, as you said, that GPT4, a model which, by the way, has been essentially trained. It's been about 18 months since it was first trained. Right? It's been around for that long. OpenAI brought in the world's best red teamers to discover all the set of dangerous capabilities it might have. They spent months doing this. They finally launched it. Since then, hundreds of millions of people have tried as hard as they can to elicit all these capabilities from the model, and everybody missed the fact that this stupid model, which has been augmented since, but this base model actually did latently have the capability, if you gave it a description of a cyber vulnerability that existed, to exploit that vulnerability. 87% success rates, that's what we talked about 6 weeks ago. economically, it is 2 to 3x more efficient if you have an identified security vulnerability with a description that you feed it. It is 2 to 3 times more efficient, roughly speaking, than getting a human cyber attacker to execute that attack. So we've already hit economic escape velocity on cyber attacks with GPT-4, and we hadn't realized it for like a freaking year and a half. And all that discourse about, oh, we'll worry about AI systems, all these applications, when we actually see something, we're missing the fact that the whole time this has actually been possible. Well, today we now know it's possible for 0 days. So when you have a description of the vulnerability that you can feed to the system, essentially that's a known vulnerability. It may not have been patched everywhere, but it's known to the world. That's a 1-day vulnerability. A 0 day, as you said, is when there's no prior knowledge of the thing. You just have to, basically plop the system in this environment and just have it discover the vulnerability from scratch, given the environment. This essentially just works. So you see a pass rate, this pass at 5 eval. Basically, you give the model 5 chances, or sorry, the system, I should say, because it's a bunch of agents working together. You give the system 5 opportunities to try to discover and execute on a 0 day attack, and 53% of the time it will succeed, right? So that's actually quite a concerning level of success rate for a 0 day vulnerability. That's actually kind of not that far from the 1 day vulnerability. Even when you give it a description of the vulnerability, this suggests that the model is actually really good at identifying those weak spots. And they do run a cost analysis for this. What they find is, with some fairly conservative assumptions, it is actually already slightly cheaper to get this model to do 0 day vulnerability exploits than a human programmer. So again, kind of reaching economic escape velocity on these attacks with this model. And this is with GPT-4, the version that OpenAI is serving up. Presumably, it's the one that has all the safety, right? So if you had access to the base model without all the safety fine-tuning, presumably you'd be able to go even further. So it's quite a remarkable paper. I think at this point, the debate is sort of over when it comes to, are language models going to be able to execute, and I mean catastrophic cyber attack? That debate, pretty hard to make the case that it's not going to happen with the next, couple turns of the crank in the next couple of years, certainly, but plausibly quite a bit sooner than that. You've already got systems here that are doing, quite significant levels of liftoff on 0 day, on 1 day vulnerability exploits, even more economically efficient than human actors. Again, even if they're wrong, these estimates are too sort of optimistic in a sense. By a factor of 2, a factor of 5, we are well on our way. And there are, I think, a lot of debates as a society that we have to now revisit on the basis of this evidence. There are some goalposts that are going to have to shift, some minds that are going to have to change, because I, for one, absolutely remember many, many discussions with very, very bright people who understand a lot of this stuff better than me, but ultimately who felt quite strongly this simply could not happen. We now live in that world, and I think there's a policy reality that needs to catch up to all this stuff.
That's right, and I think also worth noting that they evaluated this system on real-world known 0 day vulnerabilities. So they constructed a data set of 15 of them, and they have different various severities, ranging from kind of medium severities to critical severity, like source, courster, SQLI, login, or admin manage user, stuff like that. So when they say that these things can tackle 0 day vulnerabilities, that's not just like some lab proxy of a 0 day vulnerability. Like, these are real vulnerabilities. And so, yeah, yet another example of okay, you don't have to believe in AI doom or X risk to be concerned about AI and really care about alignment. And on to our last story in the synthetic media and art section. I just picked this one out because it was kind of interesting. The title of it is The Uncanny Rise of the World's First AI Beauty Pageant. So this is from the company FanView, an AI-infused creator platform. I believe there might be more to it than that, but I guess we don't need to get into it. This company launched what it calls the world's first beauty pageant for AI creators. And the contest 10 semi-finalists from over 1,500 applicants. So from what I understand, FanView has a lot of AI-generated imagery of beautiful women, let's just say. And so this is kind of what you see from that is the creators on the platform have submitted some of their creations. And yeah, there's some scoring based on their, I guess, character, but also their social media clout, stuff like that. And anyways, kind of weird, I guess we could say.
Yeah, it's making me think of, I was watching this documentary about, what's that thing that for married people there, that dating app for married people.
I forget.
Do you know what I'm talking
about? Yeah, but dating app for married people, yeah.
Yeah, there's a Netflix thing on it. God, why am I'm going OnlyFans because I'm staring at the fan view website. They got that OnlyFans, 1 million plus fans. You're like, holy crap, these are they're really big follower bases.
Yep.
Ashley Madison, that was it.
Yes.
And they were talking about how basically it turned into this like website for men to be scammed because it turns out that men tend to be the dominant user base when you set up a website like that. And they had a bunch of basically bots who were just, I guess the men would have to pay by the message or something. So the bots would just be kind of causing them to burn through money and credit. Yeah, this is the sort of thing that you could really imagine Ashley Madison using. It's pretty wild looking at these follower accounts too. Like Ben Morris, fake or AI celebrity, 770,000 subscribers. 450,000 on Spotify for Kati Karenina, which is another fake one. I don't know. It's seriously weird. It looks like it's not all, by the way, sexual stuff. It's because it is like,
yeah, a lot of it is,
YouTubers
I will say a lot
Spotify.
of it is sort of more like just an Instagram influencer type thing, or like someone who posts a lot of photos of themselves traveling or, I don't know, being fashionable, stuff like that. There's also a lot of this on that platform. But yeah, I guess the whole idea of a beauty pageant is sort of to the point of there's a whole movement towards creating AI influencers, very much mirroring what human influencers do.
Pretty wild.
Pretty wild. And with that, we are done with this episode of Last Week in AI. As always, I will mention once again that you can find our text newsletter at lastweekin.ai. You can find our emails if you want to give some feedback in the episode description, and our Twitter handles if you want to follow us and catch the stories when we retweet them, which we do sometimes. And lastly, we would appreciate if you review and share the podcast so we get more listeners. But more than anything, we like to know that you listen and enjoy. So please keep doing that and enjoy the AI-generated song that will come right after this.
Give it a cheer. Alignment and the story's clear. Drama in the open dice here. AI beauties, the future's near. Tune in next week, we've got your fix. Breaking down tech, code and the mix. Join us next time, stay in the loop. For AI chatter, join the troop. From breakthroughs to the latest scoop. In this AI world we all renew. Thanks for watching, see you real soon with more AI tales under the moon.